In the hushed, hallowed halls of international academia, where the air hums with the unspoken legacy of empires and intellect, a scene unfolded that would echo far beyond the clinking of teacups and the rustle of scholarly papers. It was a moment of quiet arrogance, a subtle, almost imperceptible scoff from two titans of the Oxford debating circuit, aimed at the foreign lilt in their opponent's English. They thought it was a laugh, a minor distraction. They had no idea they had just stepped into a carefully laid trap. This isn't just a story about a debate. It's a heartbeat, a pulse of Filipino pride, a testament to the quiet strength that rises when underestimated. It's the story of how a seemingly small act of prejudice became the fuse for an explosive, unforgettable victory, igniting not just a win, but a wave of profound vindication. The World Universities Debating Championship, or WDC, is the ultimate intellectual arena. Imagine the Olympics, but instead of physical prowess, it's a gladiatorial clash of minds, words, and wit. For decades, the champions almost exclusively hailed from the English-speaking strongholds of the US, UK, and Australia. It wasn't just about winning. It was about an unspoken hierarchy, a perceived birthright to intellectual superiority. But then, in 2023, that narrative shattered. For the first time in its 40-year history, a team from the Philippines, from Southeast Asia, clinched the entire championship. David Africa and Toby Leung of Ateneo de Manila University didn't just participate. They conquered. Standing tall in Madrid, Spain, they out-debated Princeton, Sofia, and Tel Aviv in the grand final, sending a seismic shockwave through the global debating community. Their triumph wasn't just a trophy. It was a definitive statement. Filipino debaters are not just world-class. They are world champions. Yet beyond the gleaming trophies and official records, there are battles fought that are just as significant, often more so. These are the battles for respect, for dignity, against the insidious sting of prejudice. And it's one such battle, a story that resonates deeply within the heart of every Filipino, that we delve into now. Let's journey to the semifinals of a recent World Universities Debating Championship, to a moment where two Filipino debaters, whose journey was fueled by grit and brilliance, faced off against the towering arrogance of Oxford. We'll call them Maria Fernandez and Paulo Santos. Picture the setting, a grand wood-paneled hall, steeped in the scent of old books and ambition. On one side, Jonathan Whitmore and Charlotte Ashworth, the very embodiment of Oxford's debate elite. Third-generation scholars, their English flows with the impeccable, almost theatrical rhythm of received pronunciation. They are the darlings of the European circuit, gliding through tournaments with an air of predestination, as if winning is simply their birthright. Opposite them stand Maria and Paulo, representing a university from Manila. They are scholars of extraordinary caliber, having dominated the Asian debating circuit with razor-sharp intellect. But here, in the ancestral home of British academia, they are outsiders. Their path to the semifinals has been a testament to their unwavering spirit, conquering Ivy League and top European teams alike. Yet, with every victory, they are met with a curious blend of surprise and polite congratulations, as if their presence is merely a charming anomaly. And then, there's their English. It's fluent, precise, and articulate, yet it carries the unmistakable melody of the Philippines, the distinct intonations and rhythm shaped by a vibrant tapestry of Spanish, American, and indigenous influences. To an open mind, it's a beautiful reflection of a rich cultural heritage, but to a prejudiced ear, it's a flaw, a perceived weakness before the motion is even announced. The microaggressions begin subtly, like tiny cuts. As Maria speaks with an organizer, Jonathan leans to Charlotte, a smirk playing on his lips, and quietly mimics a single word Maria used, elongating a vowel with exaggerated disdain. Charlotte suppresses a giggle behind her hand. Later, when Paulo, with polite deference, asks a simple question about speaking order, Jonathan replies in painfully slow, overly simplistic phrasing, as if addressing a child. They don't see two of the world's brightest debaters. They see two provincials from a former colony, somehow having stumbled onto the grand stage. They assume the accent denotes a lack of sophistication, believing their arguments, like their English, will be mere imitations, second-rate echoes of the real thing. Maria and Paulo see it all. They feel the familiar sting of condescension, a shadow that has followed them their entire lives, the subtle judgment, the patronizing tone. The insidious assumption that because their English sounds different, it is somehow less. But they don't react. They don't call it out. They simply exchange a quiet, knowing look. They have not come this far to be broken by arrogance. They have come to win. That condescension, those dismissive laughs, they don't extinguish their fire. They ignite a cold, unwavering inferno within them. The Oxford team believes this is just a debate about a topic. Maria and Paulo know it's a battle for their very right to be heard, to be respected, and they are ready. The prejudice Maria and Paulo faced wasn't just a personal slight. It was the echo of a deeply rooted bias known as linguistic prejudice, or linguicism. It's the insidious belief that certain languages or accents are inherently superior, a form of discrimination where intellect is judged not by ideas, but by the sound of speech. For English speakers, this bias is a direct relic of the British Empire, where the colonizer's accent, specifically the received pronunciation of the English upper class, was elevated as the singular standard. Every other accent, from Ireland to the Caribbean, and especially those of colonized peoples, was deemed a deviation, an impurity. This creates a powerful, often unconscious bias. People wrongly associate a non-standard accent with a lower level of education or intelligence. It's a cognitive shortcut that subtly reinforces old colonial power structures. The one who sounds like the historical center of power gains immediate, unearned authority, while those from the periphery must constantly strive to prove their intellectual worth. For Filipinos, this dynamic is particularly poignant and familiar. English is one of the Philippines' official languages, woven into the fabric of law, government, and education. But Filipino English is its own vibrant, valid dialect, with its own standards and rhythm, forged over a century of unique usage. Yet on the world stage, it often encounters the same condescending bias. The mockery of the Filipino accent is a common, lazy trope used to dismiss and belittle, implying a lack of intelligence, a failure to properly imitate the master. What this mockery tragically misses is that the Filipino accent isn't a failure to be American or British. It is a triumphant expression of being Filipino. This was the invisible mountain Maria and Paulo had to climb, even before uttering their first word. The Oxford team's arrogance was merely the visible peak of that mountain. They weren't just debating two people. They were debating a centuries-old prejudice, so ingrained it often masquerades as common sense. Then, the motion for the semifinal is announced, and a ripple of murmurs spreads through the hall. This house believes that former colonial powers should pay reparations to their former colonies. A heavy silence descends. Jonathan and Charlotte, arguing for the government, exchange another confident look. They believe this is their home turf. They envision themselves as the benevolent defenders of a complex history, ready to swat down the simplistic, emotional arguments they anticipate from the victims of colonialism. Maria and Paulo, for the opposition, simply nod. The fire in their eyes intensifies. The Oxford team had laughed at their colonial accents. Now, they were about to receive a profound, unforgettable lesson on what colonialism truly cost. The trap was set. The debate begins. Jonathan Whitmore, first speaker for the government, rises. He is the epitome of Oxford elegance and control, his polished baritone filling the hall with an effortless authority. Mr. Speaker, members of the House, he begins with a magnanimous smile. The motion before us today is one that certainly tugs at the heartstrings. It speaks to a history of pain and injustice, and the opposition will no doubt paint a picture of a world divided neatly into villains and victims, of a historical debt that can be paid off like a simple invoice. He pauses, letting the words hang. But we, on the side of government, don't believe the complex, messy tapestry of history can be solved with a bank transfer. In fact, we believe this policy of reparations is not only impractical but patronizing. It's a policy that traps former colonies in a state of perpetual victimhood, forever defining them by their past instead of their future. Jonathan then launches into arguments that are technically proficient but philosophically hollow. First, impracticability. Who do we pay? He asks, hands open in a gesture of fake reasonableness. Corrupt governments, descendants from centuries ago. And who pays? Today's taxpayer who has never owned a slave or colonized a country. Next, historical complexity. History isn't a morality play, he declares. The British Empire, for all its faults, wasn't pure evil. It brought trade, infrastructure, the rule of law, and yes, the English language we're all using today. To reduce this entire era to simple theft is to ignore the nuances of history. He speaks of the gifts of colonialism, framing railways and ports not as tools for resource extraction, but as benevolent contributions. Finally, he concludes with a flourish of paternalistic concern. The best reparation, he says, his voice softening, is the aid we give today. It's the partnerships we build. This motion asks us to look backward and open old wounds. We ask the House to look forward. For these reasons, we are proud to oppose. He sits down to a wave of polite applause. The argument is smooth, polished, and perfectly designed to let a Western audience off the hook. Charlotte and Jonathan are visibly pleased, confident they've already won by framing any demand for reparations as unreasonable. Then, Maria Fernandez stands up. The room is quiet. She isn't theatrical like Jonathan. She is calm, composed. She looks at the judges, then at the Oxford team, her eyes holding not anger, but a piercing analytical clarity. "Mr. Speaker," she begins, her voice with its distinct Filipino cadence steady and strong. "The Prime Minister has just given us a masterclass in deflection. He's told us our pain is too complicated to measure, our suffering too ancient to address, and our desire for justice is patronizing." She lets that word hang in the air. Let's be very clear. We are not here to talk about heartstrings. We are here to talk about structural economics. We're here to talk about the systematic, intentional, and ongoing transfer of wealth that created the modern world. And with that, the tide turns. Maria doesn't make an emotional appeal. She delivers an academic demolition. The Prime Minister asks who pays? As if the beneficiaries of colonialism are a mystery. Let's ask a better question. Which institutions, which corporations, which nations became fantastically wealthy during the colonial period? The answer isn't today's taxpayer. It's the very same economies that continue to benefit from the global inequality that colonialism established. She continues, voice gaining strength. He speaks of the gifts of infrastructure. Let's analyze that gift. Were railways built in India primarily to connect Indian communities? No. They were built to get cotton and grain from the interior to the ports so it could be shipped to London and Manchester at rock-bottom prices. Britain didn't develop its colonies. It actively underdeveloped them to eliminate competition. She then pulls out a chilling statistic. The economist Utsa Patnaik has calculated that Britain drained wealth equivalent to an estimated $45 trillion from India alone during its rule. That isn't a vague feeling of injustice. That is a number the Prime Minister finds it hard to calculate reparations. Perhaps we can start there. The room is now dead silent. The judges are scribbling furiously. Jonathan's confident smirk has vanished. Maria turns to the argument about victimhood. The Prime Minister is concerned that reparations will trap us in victimhood. I find this concern ironic. What's more patronizing than telling a people that their legitimate claim for justice is a psychological flaw? What's more trapping than a global economic system built on the theft of our resources, a system whose architecture is still in place today? She concludes, this is not about guilt. It is about debt. An economic debt that is quantifiable and a moral debt that is undeniable. We're not asking for a handout. We are demanding the return of stolen goods. She sits down. There's no applause, just a moment of stunned silence as the room recalibrates. The debate is no longer about Jonathan's vague platitudes. It's about Maria's hard, cold economic facts. Now it's Charlotte Ashworth's turn. She looks visibly rattled but tries to regain control, attacking Maria's points as being cold and academic. The deputy leader of the opposition, she begins with a sneer, has given us a rather dry lecture on economics, burying the human element under a mountain of numbers. But people are not numbers. History is not a balance sheet. Charlotte attempts to reclaim the emotional high ground, talking about shared humanity and moving on. Where does it end? She asks. Do we demand reparations from Italy for the Roman Empire? We must live in the light of the present. It's a classic but weak deflection. Paulo Santos is ready for it. When Paulo rises, he does something unexpected. He's not fiery like Maria. His demeanor is thoughtful, almost professorial. Mr. Speaker, he begins softly. The Deputy Prime Minister worries we've lost the human element. I assure you we have not. She also asks, where does it end? That's an excellent question. The answer is, it ends where the legacy of that specific injustice ends. Paulo then executes a brilliant pivot from economics to philosophy. The comparison to the Roman or Mongol empires is a fallacy. The wealth extracted by Rome is not the foundation of Italy's modern economy. The conquests of the Mongols did not create the global capitalist system we live in today, but the wealth extracted through European colonialism did. That's the crucial difference. We aren't talking about a historical event. We are talking about a historical structure whose effects are not in the past. They are painfully present. He looks directly at Jonathan and Charlotte. You see, the problem with your case is that you view colonialism as a closed chapter in a history book. We experience it as the architecture of the room we're sitting in. You talk about moving on, but you can only ask someone to move on from an injustice after you first acknowledge it. And second, after you've stopped benefiting from it. Paulo then makes post-colonial theory accessible and devastatingly personal. He talks about how colonialism wasn't just about stealing resources, but about stealing a people's right to define themselves. The greatest theft, he says, his voice resonating with quiet power, was not of gold or spices. It was the theft of identity. Colonialism imposed a worldview where one way of speaking, one way of being, was superior, and all others were inferior. The very prejudice we see in this room, the subtle mockery of an accent, is a living, breathing artifact of that theft. It's the ghost of colonialism sitting right here at the table with us. He connects it back to the motion. Reparations, then, aren't just about money. The money is simply the acknowledgement of a material crime. The act of reparations is philosophical. It is the final, definitive act of decolonization. It's the former colonizer finally admitting the relationship wasn't parent and child, but perpetrator and victim. It's an act that restores dignity, not by giving money, but by finally telling the truth. He pauses, letting his words settle. The Prime Minister spoke of partnership, but a partnership requires equals. And we can never be equals as long as one partner is still living in the house the other partner built with stolen materials, while telling them to just get over it. He sits down. The room is utterly still. The Oxford case has been completely dismantled. Maria destroyed its economic foundations and Paulo shattered its moral framework. They hadn't just rebutted the arguments, they had dissected the very mindset from which those arguments came. The Oxford team gives their final speeches, but the energy is gone. They're just repeating their earlier points, their voices lacking conviction. They are no longer debating. They are sinking. The debate ends. The three adjudicators file out to deliberate. The tension in the room is no longer just about winning or losing. It's about what was just exposed. The Oxford team sits in a stunned silence. Jonathan, who started with such effortless superiority, stares blankly at his notes. Charlotte avoids eye contact with everyone. The smirks have been replaced by the pale expressions of people who have not just been out-argued, but outclassed on a fundamental level. They came ready for an argument. They weren't prepared for an education. Maria and Paulo are quiet too, but it's the calm of exhaustion and profound vindication. They left everything on the floor. They didn't just deliver a speech. They delivered a piece of their soul, a lifetime of experience, a generation's demand for respect. The minutes feel like hours. Finally, the adjudicators return. The head adjudicator, a stern-looking woman from Australia, stands before the silent room. She begins by summarizing the debate, her tone neutral. She outlines Oxford's case, acknowledging its polish. She calls it a classic and well-delivered defense of the status quo. Then she turns to the opposition's case. The opposition, she says, did something remarkable today. They refused to engage with the debate on the superficial level it was presented. They chose instead to fundamentally reframe the entire clash. She looks at Maria, the deputy prime. Minister's speech was one of the most devastatingly effective pieces of economic argumentation I have witnessed in this championship. It took a case built on vague notions of impracticability and systematically dismantled it with historical and economic fact. She then looks at Paulo and the member for opposition. He elevated this debate from a policy discussion into a profound philosophical inquiry. He connected the motion to the legacy of colonialism, the nature of justice, and most powerfully, to the immediate context of this very room. It was as brave as it was brilliant. She takes a deep breath. Jonathan and Charlotte are now staring at the floor. The government team from Oxford presented a case that was elegant in form, but hollow at its core. It was an argument designed to evade. The opposition team from the Philippines presented a case that was intellectually rigorous, substantially deep, and morally compelling. They didn't just argue their side better. They proved their side was the only one that truly understood the stakes. She pauses for the final time. The room holds its breath. Therefore, she declares, her voice cutting through the tension, it is the unanimous decision of this panel to award the debate to the team from the opposition. For a moment, there's silence. Then the room erupts, not in polite applause, but in a wave of genuine, heartfelt ovation. People are on their feet. It's an acknowledgement of more than just a win. It's for a masterful performance, an intellectual takedown that was as complete as it was unexpected. Maria and Paulo look at each other, and the composure they held for so long finally breaks. Tears of joy and relief stream down their faces as they embrace. They did it. Across the room, Jonathan and Charlotte remain frozen in their chairs. The applause is a deafening roar of their failure. The humiliation is absolute. They weren't just beaten. They were publicly and comprehensively humbled. They had mocked their opponents' accents, only to have their own arguments exposed as shallow and ill-informed. The trap had sprung, and they were caught in it for everyone to see. In the aftermath, the story of those semifinals spread like wildfire through the championship. It became the defining moment of the tournament, the narrative irresistible, the arrogant favorites undone by the quiet brilliance of the underdogs they had so foolishly underestimated. For Jonathan and Charlotte, the loss was more than a setback. It was a public education. The certainty they walked through the world with had been shattered. They were forced to confront that their polished delivery was no match for genuine, hard-earned substance. Their prejudice wasn't just a moral failing. It was a catastrophic strategic error that blinded them to the real threat in the room. The lore of that day says they didn't just pack up and leave. They stayed, and later, Jonathan reportedly sought out Paulo. There was no grand apology, just a quiet, humbled question. What were those books you referenced? I'd like to read them. That defeat was a slice of humble pie so large it could never be finished. It forced a moment of introspection that would hopefully change how they saw the world, and how they listened to it. For Maria and Paulo, the victory was a landmark. It became a legend, a masterclass in how to dismantle an argument built on privilege and dismissiveness. It was a validation for every Filipino debater, every scholar, every professional who had ever been made to feel less than because of their accent. They proved on one of the world's most elite stages a fundamental truth. The quality of an argument has nothing to do with the accent it's delivered in. The sound of your voice is a map of your history, not a measure of your intelligence. And substance will always, in the end, crush superficial style. This story, though a dramatization, reflects a real and deeply felt experience for countless Filipinos and other non-native English speakers around the world. From the nurses in American hospitals, whose expertise is questioned because of their accent, to the engineers in Middle Eastern boardrooms who have to work twice as hard to be taken seriously, to the scholars who face the same condescension Maria and Paulo did, this battle for respect is fought every single day. What this story, and the real-life victories of debaters like David Africa and Toby Leung, shows is the undeniable power of Filipino excellence. It's an excellence forged in a complex history and a resilience built over generations. It's the ability to master a foreign language and its systems, not as an imitator, but as an innovator. To take the tools of the colonizer and use them to deconstruct the colonial house. The Filipino accent is not a mark of colonial baggage. It is a badge of honor. It is a declaration of a global identity, the sound of a culture that has endured, adapted, and thrived. It is a testament to a people who have taken a foreign tongue and made it uniquely, powerfully, and brilliantly their own. And that is a truth no amount of mockery can ever silence.